Okay, so with Nixon, of course, détente is the name of the game, thawing out the tensions. Because again, at the end of the day, and this goes in line with Vietnamization, him and Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, know that this continuing to fight this Cold War is not going to lead to anything productive. So in line with détente, thawing out these relations, or these tensions rather, they come up with an agreement. One is called SALT. It stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And what this basically does is it reduces the number of anti-ballistic missiles, which is part of this. Began in '69, will be ratified in '72. So again, just as opposed to building up your nuclear weapons, you're now reducing it for one of the first times of the Cold War. So certainly a major point here. On top of that, you have that sort of an economic relationship in the sense that since there's an abundance of wheat, this is actually where farmers do somewhat okay, they will sell a lot of that to the USSR as a sign of, or a gesture of goodwill. So certainly it works on both ends there. So again, very much in line with détente. Remember that the Soviet Union was a little worried because the US makes some peaceful relations with China after recognizing the country. Remember that China and the Soviet Union had a little bit of a rift as to who should be the really global leader of communism in the world, and their relations will not be the same. So, okay, so limiting war. So the draft ends in '73. It officially expires. It's very unpopular. You have anti-draft, protests. You have Vietnam protests. So certainly nobody wants to start another conflict. The draft expires. No surprise there that it's not going to be renewed. One thing that does happen is something called the Wars Powers Act, and it's very controversial. It's actually never been enforced, but it keeps coming up in the news. This requires the president to tell Congress anytime the president commits troops to a certain area. So as a commander-in-chief, you can send troops wherever you want, technically, and you're not really declaring war. You could be just sending them in for a special mission or something that the president sees fit. But under the Wars Power Act, the president would have 60 days to notify Congress. And if Congress doesn't approve it, then the president would have to yank out those troops. And the reason they do this is because when Nixon is president, he secretly sends troops into Cambodia. If you remember when he's Cambodiaizing the Vietnam War, because they're targeting those Vietnamese bases in Cambodia. Well, he secretly does that, and when it's finally found out, people are a little bit outraged over that. So Congress wants to require the president to notify them that any time that this happens, that Congress has to be informed over these decisions, because Congress does, at the end of the day, have the right and the constitutional obligation to declare war. So keep that in mind. So very controversial. This is sort of a way to prevent future Vietnam wars, if you will. For example, the last time the United States ever officially declared war? Any guesses? No guesses. World War II. It's the last time Congress officially declared war. All those other times, President dispatched troops. It really didn't. The War Powers Act is sort of inconsequential. And to some extent, it's seen as a legislative overreach of the president's duties. But nevertheless, it's controversial. But it was seen as a reaction to prevent future conflicts like Korea and Vietnam, that Congress must be consulted. Okay, so here we are with our new notes. Some of your parents were probably alive when this happened with the Arab oil embargo. Has anyone heard of OPEC? It's still around today. It just stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this is mainly made up of Middle Eastern countries, with the exception of like Venezuela. And basically, it's a cartel. They set the price, and they have all this oil, and they set the price. At this point, the United States has been supporting Israel. Israel is engaged in a number of wars in the Middle East. And keep in mind that Israel is the only Jewish nation surrounded by Islamic countries that basically detest their existence at this point. And because the United States is backing Israel during the Yom Kippur War, OPEC, which again is made up of mainly Middle Eastern countries that are Islamic, refused to export oil to the United States. So the United States, only having a limited amount of oil remaining, is really in a crunch. And if you see here, these are gas station lines, and you would have to alternate by the number on your license plate as to which day you would be able to get gas. And if you remember that this happened under, what was that, Hurricane Sandy, and it was very reminiscent of that. That was the last time it had happened was '73, and of course the Hurricane Sandy scenario, that was just a manufactured paranoia, hysteria going on. There was really no shortage in oil, but nevertheless, Americans had to tighten their belt quite significantly. Yeah.
Do we have slides?
Sorry. Thank you, Dylan. Here you go. Okay, so with that, as a result, and this happens under Nixon, as a result of this, you have really a push to put, for example, speed limits go down to 55 miles an hour on highways. You have this push for fuel economy cars. This has been a big initiative under President Obama to increase the miles per gallon, increase alternative fuels. Supposedly hydrogen is perhaps the new way to power vehicles and new use of energy that remains sort of untapped to some extent. So that would be quite amazing. Okay, so after '74, Nixon is going to resign. We're going to get into the Watergate scandal in the domestic policy, but long story short, for his re-election campaign, him and his election, not him specifically, but his election team breaks into the Democratic headquarters in an attempt to gain and take information. After that's found out, he resigns. He's not impeached. The only two presidents who ever been impeached are Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Right. Nixon resigns before he can be impeached. He probably would have. So as a result, his VP, Gerald Ford, who is unelected because he was the running mate, becomes the president. He will pardon Nixon to allow the country to move forward. One thing that's going to happen under Ford is the Helsinki Accords. That is, again, more of a recognition of the communist world. In exchange, you're going to have protection of basic human rights. There was alleged abuses that the USSR was doing, not only in its country, but also its satellite states. Critics, though, are a little skeptical of the Helsinki Accords in the sense that the United States was providing all this technology while the USSR was not. It was only like a one-way street. In addition, it did not really solve the issue of restrictions on emigration of Soviet Jews to leave the country and emigrate elsewhere or immigrate elsewhere. So these were some of the drawbacks, but again, showing you that really this is ushering in a period of détente even under Ford. But what's really disturbing is that while we have this period of détente, we're still not trusting the Soviets 100%, and we're still uneasy about communism. How do you know? Look at these three particular cases in Chile, as well as in Argentina, as well as in Bolivia. Each of these three times, the CIA backed a coup to get rid of their democratically elected socialist leader, because socialism equals communism. And as a result, you get rid of them, and then you put in place a dictator who isn't communistic, but that's the big point. You're not communistic. As long as you're not communistic, that's all that matters. So in these countries, you can still see that the Cold War has not thawed out 100%, that there's still a fear sort of this domino theory. So it sort of goes back to this time period. Nevertheless, things are now going to change. After Ford does not get reelected, the peanut farmer, Carter, is going to get elected, and it's really remarkable. And again, you'll talk about this in the discussion over the spring break. But Carter is a peanut farmer. To go from like a poor peanut farmer to a president is quite remarkable, and that I think was indicative of that sort of American dream, if you still believe it still exists. But again, the thing about him, focus on human rights, open diplomacy, things that he does. Panama Treaty, he gives the Panama Canal over to the country of Panama. This was even criticized as the United States got nothing in return, but if you think about how we acquired this territory back during the age of imperialism, it wasn't entirely fair. But by the start of the new year in 2000, Panama regains control. But perhaps the biggest accomplishment of Carter, and indicative of his focus on human rights and diplomacy, was the Camp David Accord. As I mentioned earlier, that Israel and the Middle East begin having a series of wars in the 70s. And as a result, he's actually able to bring the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, as well as the Israeli prime minister together at Camp David. And they officially recognize each other as countries. So for Egypt, which was an Islamic country at the time, to recognize Israel was a huge deal. Unfortunately, when the Egyptian president goes back to Egypt, he later gets assassinated for shaking the prime minister's hand from Israel. But it was certainly indicative of how Carter was trying to usher in this period of diplomacy, focus on human rights, etc. And here's a look at the close election between Carter and Ford. Carter coming, edging him out. All right, real quickly. So we had SALT 1. SALT 2 is not going to be all that productive as a result of the fact that the Soviet Union is going to invade Afghanistan. More on that a little bit later. You'll also remember that we put up a Shah in Iran that was pro-United States, provided a lot of oil. Well, guess what? There's a revolution, and it's done by fundamentalists who are anti-American. This is sort of the law of unintended consequences. It's going to sort of bite you in the butt, so to speak, in the sense that they're going to have a revolution. It's going to be anti-United States, and they even are going to capture the Tehran embassy where Americans are there. And the American embassy is under control for 440 days, and it's also going to spark another oil crisis as a side effect, as you see there. So, as I mentioned before, the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan, and this is going to become Russia's Vietnam. It's a war that the Russians do not win, but they occupy Afghanistan for a good amount of time. And as a result of this, the United States is going to boycott the Olympics. Carter's even going to try to bring about the draft again. But of course, with the Vietnam War in the mindset of a lot of people that just happened, there's no way that that's going to be allowed. So real quickly, back to the Iranian hostage crisis. This is sort of a bleak time for Carter. It hits the remainder of his presidency, and they're not freed until President Reagan comes into power. But when Carter tries to have a mission to free them, this fails as the helicopters actually crash into them. So it's indicative of sort of a failed presidency as Americans saw it at that time. So there you go. Have a great spring break. If you have any questions, email me.